That evening, the water roared ominously beneath the bridge. Black and impenetrable, it drew everything into its endless darkness. So Y stood at the edge, his fingers hesitating, just one step away from his goal. A torrent of thoughts flooded his mind, and all that remained was for him to take that final step to meet his desire. But suddenly, a strange sound nearby caught his attention. A luxury car sped past him at high speed. In an instant, the vehicle began to brake sharply, but due to the wet weather, it started to skid. And thus, the accident occurred, hoping nothing serious had happened. So Y made his way toward the car. However, no one responded, which only heightened his concern, and for a moment, he even considered breaking the window. Suddenly, to his surprise, the door swung open, knocking him off his feet. A clearly distressed man stepped out, muttering quietly that if his brother found out, it would be the end of him. Observing this, the protagonist immediately sized up the man. Tall, but seemingly no older than 20, possibly a minor who had stolen his older brother's car. Then, out of nowhere, the driver angrily asked what the protagonist was doing here alone, in the middle of the night, dressed entirely in black like some kind of angel of death, suggesting that this was the reason for the crash. The protagonist was taken aback by such an attitude and directly asked who had given the driver the right to speak to him that way, and out of curiosity, inquired about the man's age. The stranger suddenly grew anxious and claimed to be 25. Yet he looked no older than 20. And the protagonist was curious why he had taken his brother's car. This angered the driver, who declared that it was, in fact, his own car, a gift from his mother in celebration of passing his entrance exams. This piqued the protagonist's interest, as the car was clearly expensive, and he doubted the exams were so significant. Yet it was obvious the man was more worried about his brother's reaction to what had happened here. When asked about insurance, it turned out he had never bothered with such things. But that wasn't the issue. His brother had strictly forbidden him from driving, saying it would only be allowed from next year, and if he found out about this, nothing good would come of it. From his reaction, the protagonist guessed that money didn't concern the man. It was his brother he feared. Clearly, this person was the son of a wealthy family, and judging by his scent, an alpha too. In the end, the protagonist concluded that he had no reason to be concerned over some rich stranger. Aloud, he asked why the man had crashed into the barrier when he should have just aimed for him. He believed it would have been better if, instead of the damaged fence, it had been his own body in its place. But since the driver was unharmed, his help was no longer needed. He had a very good reason to come here, having long wanted to do it, but even now, it felt as if he lacked the strength. Suddenly, the same young man caught up with him, offering him money. However, the protagonist was expected to lie to the brother about the true cause of the accident. The next morning, So Y realized he had caught a cold, though it was no surprise, having stood in the rain all night with winter in full swing. That day, his boss once again harassed him, and the employee barely restrained himself. Later, he simply went home, bringing his fever along. On his way home, he decided to scroll through his phone messages. One of his friends asked how the memorial service went and if Park Jin-chal had helped. But So Y mentioned that they had parted ways, which evoked an amused reaction from his friend, who then suggested they go out for drinks. Perhaps the reaction was overly cheerful, but 6 months in a relationship was a record for him. Park Jin-chul had been a new client of theirs. They had spent the night together on their second day of acquaintance, after which they decided to start dating. It seemed he enjoyed being with someone with such an omega nature, and maybe, had So Y been an alpha, he would have pushed for marriage. But that story was long in the past, which is why the protagonist agreed to meet his friend this weekend. Upon returning home, he concluded that there was far too much space for just one person. He still couldn't get used to the icy silence that seeped into his soul. After work, So Y returned to his routine, which poisoned his entire existence. And so, all the day's tasks were completed, leaving the question of what to do next. The protagonist even found himself wondering what people with families or friends did in such situations. Suddenly, he received a message from someone named Choi Son-hoon regarding his younger brother with whom the protagonist had collided, and the man asked to call back when convenient. At the moment when the driver offered to lie to his brother, he also mentioned he was willing to pay a considerable sum. Handing over some cash immediately, the man assured him that if everything was handled properly, he would pay even more. For that reason, it was now decided that one phone call wouldn't hurt. At least, that's what he thought. It was a meeting that turned everything upside down, and the man responsible for it, there was no denying. This encounter was something extraordinary. After informing that they could connect again the following morning, So-Wai collapsed onto his bed, hoping their stories about the accident would align. Suddenly, his phone vibrated, indicating that he was permitted to call right away. As soon as he heard the man's voice, the protagonist immediately realized he was an alpha, and a rather impressive one at that. The respectable man first apologized for calling so late, but there were urgent details that needed clarification. Understanding nothing, So-Wai assured him that Sun Hen was a very good person, the kind you rarely meet these days. However, the reply he received was simply that they would meet tomorrow, and he was asked to specify the time and place. Although the protagonist suggested handling everything over the phone, the man insisted on a time and place for a meeting. In the end, it became clear that while this person tried to be polite, he was quite persistent. So-Wai decided to show a bit of character and set the meeting at a time convenient for him. Regardless, that voice didn't grant him the right to behave in such a manner. That man must be a looker, judging by the appearance of his younger brother. Yet So-Wai decided to dismiss such thoughts, as not long ago he had broken up with someone he had once considered a lover. First things first, he needed to sort out matters with that young man. Dialing the necessary number, the man explained that he had already spoken with his brother and that they would meet tomorrow. For some reason, the response was only silence. Then suddenly the voice of the older brother came through. It turned out that Sun Hen's phone was in his possession. He had to play dumb, claiming he was just checking in to see how he was doing, but would have to ask another time. When the line went silent again, he realized just how close he had come. The next day, after work, the employee, as usual, prepared to leave, but his annoying boss was once again pestering him, asking if he was heading out on a date. His boss explained his concern by saying he was worried about him as he didn't look well. And perhaps, he mused, So-Wai had finally found himself an alpha to have fun with, which is why he seemed so energized. In the end, the protagonist had to threaten that if he uttered one more word like that, he would report him to the police for harassment. So-Wai arrived at the meeting in an upscale place he had never even heard of, which made him feel somewhat uneasy. A staff member escorted him to the room where the meeting was to take place. There, waiting for him, was the distinguished man, and the protagonist's first impression was that he resembled a gangster. With a forced smile, the protagonist addressed him as Sun Hen's brother, noting that he had arrived early. However, the younger brother's name was actually Sunghoon, though So-Wai truly couldn't care less. This only irritated the man further, but one word from the older brother was enough to make the younger fall silent. Their meeting began with the older brother noting that So-Wai surely understood the reason he had been summoned here. As planned, the protagonist began praising Sun Hen, once again emphasizing what a fine person he was. However, this wasn't the response the elder had expected, so he had to add that of course he would cover the car repair costs. Though in truth, he knew the young man nearby would be the one paying, which kept a smile on his face. Suddenly, the older brother asked him not to lie, as he wasn't someone who would believe his younger sibling was capable of such a thing. Yet So-Wai continued to play along, insisting that while it might be hard to believe, he had no reason to lie. This charade, however, provoked the man's anger, as he had already suspected the truth and asked how much the younger had paid him. The protagonist had no intention of betraying his client, so he feigned innocence, acting as though he had no idea what the man was talking about. But since his words weren't working, he decided to assert himself, pointing out that the man was being rather impenetrable, though in truth, he hadn't taken anything. When asked how he dared raise his voice to the brother, So-Wai simply responded that the man had started it, so the question should be directed back at him. In the end, Choi Sun-hoon concluded that the words and behavior of So-Wai indicated he had never truly intended to end his life. He explained his change of heart by saying he had simply reconsidered thanks to Sonnen and that the older brother should be proud of him. Nonetheless, the man was genuinely curious whether the person in front of him had really planned to jump off the bridge. The protagonist assured him there could be no other reason for him to have come there in the dead of night, during a torrential downpour, and joked that the boy deserved a medal for that. In any case, the man stated that he didn't believe a word of it, but he didn't have time to deal with it now, so they would be in touch later. With a forced smile, So-Wai pretended to regret that Choi Sun-hoon was leaving already, suggesting they could have stayed a bit longer. Suddenly, his conversation partner agreed and decided to linger for a while. This turn of events took So-Wai by surprise, so he added that if the man had any business to attend to, he wouldn't dare delay him. The older brother could see through the protagonist's true emotions and seemed to enjoy provoking him, asking if he really should leave. Eventually, he got the reaction he was after, leading the protagonist to feel as though the man was simply toying with him. In the end, he stated that after he left, they would still bring food, so they could have dinner together and then part ways peacefully. Having said this, the distinguished man put on his coat. He looked so striking that it was hard to tear one's eyes away from him. Noticing the intense gaze on him, he asked if something was wrong. With a nervous laugh, So-wai had to explain that the man had an excellent physique, and his broad shoulders were almost rectangular. Though, typically, people are compared to triangles in such cases. But the protagonist saw no difference in that and didn't care at all. In any case, they agreed they would be in touch later. As soon as Choi Sun-hoon stepped over the threshold, he was met with bows from several people. He also met with his assistant, and So-wai overheard snippets of their conversation, where something about business and a corpse was mentioned. Since it was unclear what exactly had been said, So-wai decided it was better to assume he had misheard. However, once they were alone, he asked the younger if his brother was part of the mafia. With some concern, Sonin assured him that his brother was a financier, and anyway, So-wai wasn't weak if he dared to speak to him like that. Usually, things didn't end well in such situations. When asked to explain, the younger remarked that not only gangsters could raise a hand against someone, but So-wai, at his age, had never heard of an ordinary office worker killing someone for being overly familiar. When asked how old the older brother was, it turned out he was about to turn 31. Hearing this, the man affirmed that he had expected him to be older because the brother, at that moment, he realized he had nearly said something he didn't want to share with anyone. So he changed his statement, saying that the brother looked quite mature. However, Sonhyun took this as a suggestion that his older brother looked ancient. Though, according to him, he looked no older than 20 when walking around the house with his hair down. At that moment, the protagonist concluded that the young man seemed to idolize his brother. But that odd brother wasn't so bad either. Perhaps intimidating in appearance, but he cared for the boy like his own child. They had a wonderful relationship, just as he had once had with his own brother. The next day, So-wai once again postponed his meeting with a friend who wanted to go out drinking, as if it would be the last time in his life. Only last night, that man had called him again and asked to meet at a hotel restaurant. And when an alpha invited an omega to a hotel, one had to be prepared for all kinds of outcomes. At the entrance, an employee was already waiting for him, assuring him that director Choi Sun-hoon was expecting him. As he made his way inside, So-wai began to feel as if he'd entered a nightclub, given the surprisingly large amount of security around. Upon arriving at the meeting room, he found that the younger brother was also present. The man clearly hadn't expected to see anyone else, especially since he had spent quite a bit of time putting together the right look for this meeting. Meanwhile, the director pointed out that their guest had arrived early today, but in any case, it was best to eat together before discussing business. The atmosphere around them was strangely serious, which made him uncomfortable, so he immediately decided to lighten the mood. For that reason, he brought up the day's cold weather, which could only get worse with time. Hearing a brief acknowledgement, So-wai mentioned the first snow, which he hadn't yet seen, hoping that it might still fall. No matter how hard he tried to engage in casual conversation, no one seemed inclined to talk, leaving the atmosphere awkward. Eventually, Choi Sun-hoon spoke up, reminding him that the protagonist had mentioned wanting to end his life. The man didn't immediately understand what was being referred to, but he decided to repeat, just in case, that it was true and that Sun-hen had saved him. But again, this wasn't quite right, prompting his conversation partner to suggest that So-wai was terrible with names, and he even grew curious if the protagonist had remembered his own. However, no matter how many guesses So-wai made, none of them were correct. This prompted a restrained bout of laughter from the younger brother, as it seemed this was being done deliberately. Even the normally serious director was mildly amused by the situation. However, So-wai truly wasn't someone who could remember names easily, and this laughter only angered him. In the end, the man reintroduced himself as Choi Sun-hoon and handed over his business card, which indicated he was from a very large company. Though it couldn't quite compare, the protagonist handed him his own business card in return. In any case, the director became more serious and asked that from this moment onward, they only speak the truth about what happened on the bridge that day. But the man's tone didn't sit well with So-wai, so he had to remind him that he had genuinely wanted to die there and didn't understand why no one believed him. It turned out that the man already had surveillance footage from that night, and the younger brother finally admitted that his brother had known everything from their very first meeting. The elder brother then stated that, as could be seen on the video, the younger brother saw a man in a black suit and, frightened, crashed into the bridge. At that moment, tension began to rise, and the protagonist realized he had no intention of returning the money. In the end, he decided to show something he had absolutely not wanted to reveal. It was a note he had written before they had even collided. In it, he had stated his desire to leave this world, as he saw no reason to continue. Hoping that this note might change the director's mind and make him realize that So-wai truly had intended to end his life that way. The younger brother was visibly shocked, clearly not expecting that the protagonist had genuinely planned to die that night. However, this reaction was entirely unhelpful at the moment, as it only jeopardized them further. In the end, So-wai had to reassure them, claiming he no longer thought about it, and that thanks to Sun-hen, he had found the will to keep living. Choi Sun-hoon concluded that his brother had indeed done a good deed, something to be proud of. The young man could offer no comment in response. Nevertheless, all of this had been done to secure his payment, and So-wai could no longer tolerate any delays. Finally, the director apologized for his mistrust, but still wanted to know the reason behind So-wai's desire to end his life. It wasn't an easy thing to explain, as much had happened in his life, and besides, So-wai wondered if it was even necessary to look for a reason. He even asked whether the elder brother had ever contemplated death himself. In truth, Choi Sun-hoon didn't quite know what to make of the question. The answer was so brief that it seemed as though the man didn't understand such matters at all. But since they had resolved the situation, he decided it was time to go, adding that they would undoubtedly meet again. The younger brother quietly chimed in, saying they would contact each other later to discuss the details of the reward. Immediately after this meeting, another one followed, this time with his friend Van Jo in a more casual setting. They went to a cafe where they talked about the memorial service, noting how difficult it was to deal with it alone. Van Jo had thought that So-wai would at least support Park Jin-chol, and that they would begin their life together, as often happens with such couples. He was genuinely curious about why they had broken up, especially since they had talked about marriage not so long ago. In any case, Van Jo was eager to know if So-wai had set his sights on anyone else, considering he wasn't a bad guy and could easily jump into a new relationship. When no response came, Van Jo concluded that their relationship had already reached the bedroom. But that wasn't true. So-wai was convinced they were from different worlds, and besides, that alpha was indecently wealthy. Accepting those thoughts and surrendering himself into someone else's hands seemed utterly impossible. Suddenly, a phone call diverted his attention. It was the same young man who, for some reason, still refused to introduce himself during their conversations. He stated that he could hand over the money in person and would notify So-wai of the meeting location via message. So-wai barely had time to say goodbye before the line abruptly went dead, something that irritated him greatly. In the end, he found himself at the agreed-upon place, a decent establishment, perfect for a money handover. Soon enough, his client arrived. When asked why So-wai had shown up 10 minutes early, he simply replied that such matters couldn't be delayed. In any case, he was now expecting his well-earned money, which equaled 2 months' salary. However, instead of an envelope, what ended up in his hands was a watch. It turned out the young man didn't have any cash on him because his brother had blocked all his credit cards. Of course, his brother had praised him for doing a good deed, but after secretly wrecking a stolen car, he had completely frozen all of his accounts. Thus, the young man had decided to make amends with the watch, which was practically brand new and from a well-known brand, worth far more than the amount they had agreed upon. Since they had now settled things, Sun-hen decided to leave first, reminding So-wai that security was outside and advising him to wait a few minutes before leaving. Before parting, he assured So-wai that they would see each other again, though the protagonist couldn't understand why he would ever need to meet him again. Nonetheless, he had been given something quite valuable, which he now had to either sell or wear like a bracelet, even though he had never owned anything as expensive as this watch. Suddenly, the director walked in, immediately commenting on how long it had been since they'd seen each other. At first, So-wai thought it was some sort of setup, as that's exactly what it looked like. But Choi Sun-hoon remained calm and took a seat across from him. So-wai decided to stop panicking and behave as naturally as possible, assuring him that he hadn't expected to see the director there. However, the director quickly pointed out that this was no coincidence, so his earlier suspicions had not been unfounded. Choi Sun-hoon then remarked that he had seen that watch somewhere before, to which So-wai responded that it was a famous brand, so it wasn't surprising. But the director wasn't fooled. With a sudden seriousness, he asked how long So-wai planned to keep deceiving him. Just the sound of his voice sent a chill through So-wai, as the man wasn't even releasing any pheromones. Yet there was an overwhelming power emanating from him. The director went on to assert that his brother had clearly gotten himself into trouble and, to avoid deeper issues, had brought someone else into the mess. And since So-wai was greedy enough, he happily agreed to the proposition. Regarding the suicide note, the director stated that he had hundreds of such notes at home, so there was nothing new in it for him. Looking at So-wai, he couldn't believe he truly wanted to die, and since there was no further proof, he concluded that the entire situation had been orchestrated by the two of them. When no reply came, he realized he was right, as someone with those tendencies would never admit to it so easily. Yet So-wai had done so without hesitation. So, out of curiosity, he wondered where his brother had even found such a beggar, one seemingly willing to do anything for a few coins. Those words stung deeply, for the director knew nothing about him. In fact, it had been the anniversary of his older brother's death that day. He, like everyone, had a family, but they died in an accident when So-wai was still very young. His parents died immediately, while his older brother passed away a week later in the hospital. That day marked the anniversary of his brother's death, and right after the memorial service, he had a strong urge to die. If not for his younger brother intervening, he would have surely jumped off the bridge. Choi Sun-hoon asked the obvious question. Why hadn't this happened last year, or even earlier? Why did he want to die now? The truth was, So-wai didn't want to outlive his brother. His brother had died at 27, and now that So-wai was the same age, the guilt overwhelmed him, driving him to end it all. After reflecting on this, the elder brother admitted that the story had convinced him, if only for a moment. It seemed, at least for a second, that So-wai truly did want to die. This reaction to his sincerity was starting to genuinely irritate him. People don't follow a script in such situations. They can laugh, even when they're in deep pain. But that was precisely what the man was talking about. From the way So-wai looked, you couldn't tell he wanted to die, which made it hard to believe. Those words finally pushed the protagonist over the edge, and he even considered showing his psychiatric evaluation to prove his point. Even now, he still felt the desire to end it all, and he hadn't lied when he said that his younger brother had saved him. He really had shown up at just the right time. So, the best decision now was to end this conversation and quietly part ways. He was even willing to return the watch. In truth, So-wai hated revisiting the past. His mood would immediately sour whenever he thought about that day, especially the hand that had so desperately tried to pull him out of the cold water. Now he was doing his best to hold back tears. He had managed to keep them in for 10 years, and there was no reason to start now. Suddenly, Choi Sun-hoon offered to let him keep the watch as an apology for the inconvenience caused. In the end, the tone shifted back to something more formal, signaling that their conversation was over. So-wai already hated this man for reopening old wounds, though he had to admit that his physique was exceptional. But dwelling on such trivial things was pointless. He'd be better off going home to rest, as he still wasn't fully recovered. And the wind outside was surprisingly cold, which brought on a bout of coughing. The director, noticing this, remarked that So-wai must have gone back to the river, but the protagonist wasn't interested in continuing the topic. When offered a ride home, he declined, mentioning that he had another meeting scheduled. And with that, he called a taxi for himself. There was a small twinge of regret, as they were unlikely to meet again. In the end, life was returning to its usual course, and he wished he could marry some wealthy alpha, build a strong, loving family with him. Suddenly, a call came through from his uncle. So-wai assumed the man was trying to set him up with another fool, which made him unhappy about the call. Apparently, the elder was displeased by So-wai's tone and unleashed his frustration on his nephew. Though in truth, he just wanted to sell him off like some slave. And now, it seemed, the uncle was back at it, claiming to know a wealthy alpha with whom So-wai could meet. The protagonist responded with skepticism, sarcastically suggesting that the man was probably divorced and pushing 50. His uncle, however, clarified that the man was 45 and indeed divorced, just as So-wai had expected. This had been going on since he was 19, and it hadn't stopped since. With nothing left to lose, So Wai asked where the meeting would take place. In truth, he attended these dates for only one reason. All the alphas his uncle set him up with were wealthy, and he really did want to marry someone like that. And now, it seemed possible that, at this rate, he might actually find his match. Just as he closed his eyes, his phone began to ring again. It turned out to be the younger brother, who asked whether there was anything engraved on the back of the watch. Looking at it, So Wai confirmed that there was something in English. It translated to a message of congratulations on his 17th birthday from his mother. It became clear that this watch had been a gift from his mother. So, though it felt awkward, the young man wanted the watch back, admitting that while he personally didn't care much for it, his father would want to see it. Ever since their mother had passed, he had been collecting anything and everything related to her. Without much thought, So Wai agreed, merely asking when the watch should be returned. After the call ended, the protagonist realized that their mother had also passed away, which might explain why Choi Sun-hoon hadn't shown any empathy toward him. Now it was clear why the man had been so tactless. This made So Wai curious. Did Choi Sun-hoon have similar unresolved issues? The next day, he went to the appointed place, determined to get this over with quickly, as his hormones had started acting up at the worst possible time. He had to take suppressants just in case, though his headache still lingered. Looking around, it seemed as if everyone there was on a date, and he alone stood out, feeling completely out of place. Suddenly, a man who resembled a gangster approached him and asked him to follow. It turned out they were heading toward a large building. Inside, his curiosity only grew. The deeper they went, the more it felt like it wasn't the younger brother who had summoned him, but rather the older man. And his instincts were right. There sat the director, who immediately asked if he had eaten yet. The protagonist didn't immediately understand why he had been brought there, but honestly admitted he hadn't done anything. So they offered him a salmon dish, as he had apparently enjoyed it very much the last time. This caught him off guard since he had never mentioned it to anyone, though he had to admit the fish had indeed been delicious. Since Choi Sun-hoon was willing to pay for the entire meal, So Wai simply thanked him for his kindness. This brought a slight smile to the director's face. However, this reaction didn't sit well with So Wai. It felt like some kind of test, and he wasn't passing it. Eventually, the man spoke into his earpiece, stating that it was time to wrap things up. Realizing that the conversation hadn't been directed at him the whole time, the guest blushed deeply. Meanwhile, Choi Sun-hoon now knew that So Wai had a fondness for salmon. So the director immediately ordered a salmon dish to be added to the order and requested that they be left alone. The director's laughter caused quite a stir among his subordinates, but they had no choice but to comply. In any case, the protagonist wanted to know where Sun Hen was and why the older brother had shown up instead. It turned out Sun Hen was under house arrest, as their father had been furious with him. The guest already had some ideas about why this had happened. Nevertheless, he had come to return the watch, as he hadn't realized it was a gift from their mother. The man knew this, which was why he had also brought along an envelope from his younger brother. Thus, they made a mutually beneficial exchange. Holding the envelope, So Wai's first thought was that it contained some kind of vouchers since it had been mentioned that there was no cash available. Suddenly, Choi Sun-hoon threw the watch box aside. This naturally outraged his companion, as it was a gift from their late mother. When asked to explain his last statement, the protagonist remarked that Sun Hen had told him she had passed away, which was why their father had been collecting her belongings. But it turned out that she had only gone on a week-long trip with her former classmates, and their father couldn't bear a day without her, so he was gathering sentimental trinkets. The moment he realized there had been a misunderstanding, So Wai started blushing again, embarrassed by his mistakes. He couldn't understand why he had been getting himself into such ridiculous situations lately. Suddenly, the man reminded him that he had prepared something, and they could now try it. It didn't take long before the guest realized that the most important thing right now was not to get drunk. After all, even if he didn't mind spending the night with this alpha, he didn't want to forget it all later. He noticed the man's sharp nose, proud chin, and the scar that stretched across his cheek. No matter how you looked at it, this person was quite impressive. And So Wai found himself wondering what it would be like to date someone so striking. With every glass, he understood that now was not the time to get drunk like this. There was only one thing he needed to confirm, and his current state encouraged him to ask whether Choi Sun-hoon had a partner. The director, showing no signs of intoxication, simply replied that he didn't. Curious about the reason, So Wai also wondered if the man could smell his scent, as by now he should surely have smelled like wet roses. In response, the man asked if So-Wai had a partner, which of course he didn't. Suddenly, the protagonist felt a wave of sadness. Everyone seemed to have a partner, yet he had no one. He had tried dating a few times, but none of those relationships worked out, even though he had treated them well. At that moment, the drunken Omega began to drift off to sleep despite efforts to wake him. So-Wai immediately felt better when a firm hand touched his shoulder, and he realized how wonderful it would be to have someone who could support him with just a touch. But he had no one at all. In the end, he surrendered to the stranger's hand, once again mumbling that he had no one. Every thought caused him considerable pain, making it hard to hold back tears. Yet, along with the sorrow, something else was trying to surface. Something even harder to restrain than tears, and evidently he couldn't hold it back. In his drunken haze, the protagonist could only hear fragments of conversations, including the boss ordering someone not to kill. He also caught annoyed comments about him, and the fact that Choi Sun-hoon was planning to take him to a room himself. The next morning, So-Wai realized that his entire body refused to cooperate, and it was all because he had drunk as if it were his last time, though he hadn't forgotten anything. And those memories now filled him with intense shame. The previous day's events stirred a renewed desire to end it all, as he had never felt such humiliation before. But the most horrifying part of the whole situation was something else entirely. It was the fact that he had tried to seduce this man,